Forget everything you thought you knew about Roman emperors. Basiliscus, a man who briefly sat on the throne, managed to lose an empire not through military defeat but through a series of epic blunders and a ruthless struggle for power with his own kin. This isn't just about a lost war. It's about a man outmaneuvered by his sister-in-law and the unexpected return of Zeno. Get ready for a shocking tale of Roman politics. The story carries the name of two emperors, Basiliscus and Zeno, but its true subject is something older and more dangerous than either man. The Eastern Roman throne itself, a crown that could not be worn like armor. It had to be negotiated hour by hour between the palace, the army, the church, and the streets of Constantinople. In the mid-5th century, the empire still called itself Roman, still spoke the language of Caesar and Augustus, but its center of gravity had shifted. The West staggered and dimmed. The East survived by becoming a machine of ceremony and compromise, a state that could endure weak rulers so long as the system remained intact. Basiliscus did not understand the system. Zeno did, even when it hated him. The conventional account is clean and satisfying. Zeno, an Isaurian outsider, becomes emperor. Court intrigues drive him out. Basiliscus usurps the throne. Basiliscus governs badly. Zeno returns. Basiliscus falls. The moral on the surface seems obvious. Competence beats incompetence. Legitimacy defeats opportunism. Yet the closer the story is held, the more that simplicity dissolves. Basiliscus did not merely fail. He was failed by a court that could manufacture emperors and unmake them, and by a set of loyalties that ran through bedrooms and chapels as much as through barracks. He did not lose the empire in a battlefield catastrophe. He lost it in a contest over what Roman even meant in a Christian capital, where the emperor was expected to be both ruler and guardian of orthodoxy. When Leo I died in 474, the empire did not pass smoothly from one strong hand to another. It passed through an uneasy relay. Leo had been a soldier emperor, raised not by old senatorial pedigree, but by the power brokers of the army and palace. His reign had seen the rising dominance of generals and the deliberate promotion of new men who could serve the throne without becoming its masters. His grandson Leo II, still a child, was crowned, then quickly elevated his father Zeno as co-emperor. Within months the child was dead, leaving Zeno alone. Zeno, born Tarasicodissa in Isauria, carried the stigma of a provincial commander from a mountainous region long stereotyped by Constantinopolitan elites as semi-barbarous. He was married into the Theodosian line through Ariadne, Leo's daughter, yet the marriage could not dissolve the sneer of the capital. In Constantinople, legitimacy was not only blood, it was accent, ritual, and familiarity. Zeno possessed the crown, but not the city's affection. In that gap, conspiracies breed like mold in damp stone. Basiliscus was not a stranger. He was the brother of Verina, Leo I's widow, an empress dowager who did not intend to fade into piety. Basiliscus had once held real prestige. He had been given command in 468 of the vast expedition against the Vandals, the maritime menace that controlled North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. That enterprise ended in spectacular disaster. Ships burned, men drowned, treasure wasted on a scale so enormous that later generations could remember it as a turning point in imperial fortunes. Basiliscus survived politically, which in Constantinople sometimes mattered more than winning. Survival meant connections, and Basiliscus had the most valuable connection of all, the imperial family's women. The overthrow of Zeno in 475 has often been described as a revolt against an unpopular Isaurian emperor. That is true, but incomplete. Zeno did not simply lose power because he was disliked. He lost because a coalition formed that believed it could rule better without him, and because the palace, the army commanders, and the religious establishment could be made to move in the same direction for a moment. Basiliscus became the face of that coalition, but the hands behind the face were many. Among them, the most underestimated were the women who understood the palace as an ecosystem, Verina and Ariadne, whose loyalty to her husband competed with her loyalty to the dynasty she embodied. The coup unfolded with the peculiar efficiency of Constantinopolitan politics. A few well-placed defections controlled rumors, a sense that the city itself was turning. Zeno fled, not because his army was annihilated, but because staying meant the possibility of being trapped inside the capital, inside a place where emperors could be besieged by their own people. Basiliscus entered, acclaimed, and crowned. His ascent looked almost orderly. That was the deception. Order in Constantinople was not proof of stability. It was the prelude to another reversal. Basiliscus sat on a precarious throne from the first hour. He owed his crown to allies who expected payment, influence, and safety. He owed it to the Senate and the populace who demanded a ruler that felt Roman in speech and habit. He owed it to the Church, which in this century could rally crowds and shame emperors with sermons. And he owed it to Verina's network, an invisible court within the court, whose support could change into hostility without warning. The new emperor faced not a single opponent, but a geometry of power with each point capable of pulling the whole shape apart. In the orthodox telling, Basiliscus fell because he was incompetent. In a deeper sense, he fell because he mistook the throne for a prize rather than a position, because he believed the act of seizing power was equivalent to possessing it. The first act of his reign would reveal whether he understood who had truly put him there. The answer would come, not from the army, but from Verina. Verina appears in the sources as a figure of scandal and influence, praised by no one who feared her and trusted by no one who needed her. Yet in a court built on access, she was access. As the widow of Leo I, she carried the aura of the previous reign and the memory of stability. She also carried grudges, ambitions, and the instincts of survival developed in a world where women were formally excluded from command but informally central to succession. In the palace, where emperors married legitimacy and mothers guarded dynasties, an empress dowager could become the hinge on which history swung. It was Verina who helped make Basiliscus possible. She had reason to resent Zeno, resentment of his Isaurian entourage, resentment at her own diminishing influence under a son-in-law who did not depend on her. Some sources suggest she also desired to raise to power a favorite, the patrician Patricius, a man whose name flickers through the narrative like a shadow at the edge of torchlight. Whether Patricius was lover, client, or simply instrument, the point is the same. Verina was a builder of factions. Basiliscus, her brother, was a convenient vehicle, imperial enough to be acceptable, male enough to be crowned, related enough to be claimed as family, while still controllable. But this is where Basiliscus' story becomes more interesting than a mere cautionary tale of incompetence. He did not simply inherit a coalition. He inherited a coalition designed to be temporary. In Constantinople, the people who brought down an emperor were rarely the same people who wished to see the next emperor grow strong. A strong emperor repays favors with independence. A weak emperor repays them with continued dependence. Basiliscus, intoxicated by sudden elevation, moved quickly to transform his seizure into a dynasty of his own. He crowned his wife Zenonis as Augusta, and he elevated his son Marcus as Augustus. In a world where titles were weapons, this was a statement. The new regime was not a caretaker, it was a replacement. That act may have stabilized his household, but it destabilized his coalition. It threatened those who had imagined Basiliscus as a bridge, not a destination. Verina, who had spent years near the center of power, understood instantly what it meant. Her brother was no longer a proxy. He was becoming a rival. The court began to split along lines that never appear in official proclamations. Generals calculated who would pay them, and whether their past betrayals would be forgiven. Senators listened for the tone of the city. Churchmen measured the emperor's theology with the precision of accountants, because a wrong word could ignite riots. In this environment, Verina did what palace survivors do. She adjusted. Her campaign did not resemble an open revolt. It was not banners in the streets. It was whispers, introductions, a hand on a shoulder in the right corridor, a promise made to a man who felt overlooked. She had spent years watching how emperors were isolated, first by turning friends into skeptics, then by turning skeptics into enemies, and finally by ensuring that when crisis arrived, no one would risk his life to save a sinking regime. Basiliscus supplied her with opportunities. Every error he made became a lever. Every broken promise became a thread she could pull. He owed much to military men who had helped expel Zeno, among them powerful commanders whose loyalty was never free. Basiliscus favored some, slighted others, and in doing so revealed a fatal misunderstanding. He believed that gratitude could bind men who had just proven they could betray an emperor. Verina, watching, could see the outlines of his isolation before he could. Even the church could be used as a blade. Constantinople's patriarch, Acacius, was not merely a cleric. He was a political force whose support could legitimate or delegitimize. If Basiliscus angered the religious establishment, Verina's network could magnify the anger into a storm. If he frightened senators with confiscations or heavy taxes, she could make their discontent find a leader. If he elevated his own family too boldly, she could remind others that dynasties were not born solely from blood, but from acceptance. The irony of Verina's power is that it was greatest when it was least visible. The sources rarely give her speeches. They show her in motion, supporting, withdrawing, reappearing. To later moralists, such maneuvering could be dismissed as feminine intrigue. In truth, it was simply politics practiced by someone whose tools were not legions but loyalties. Basiliscus's court became a theater in which applause could be arranged and silence could be fatal. The same corridors that had carried Basiliscus toward the throne now carried rumors in the opposite direction. The emperor, enthroned beneath mosaics and gold, could feel the air changing and still not know where the draft came from. Verina did not need to overthrow him by force. She needed to ensure that when the moment arrived, no one would catch him as he fell. That moment would come because Basiliscus did something more dangerous than offend individuals. He offended systems, and once systems turned against him, Verina's shadow network would not merely undermine him, it would become the channel through which the empire's frustration found its release. Basiliscus's reign was short enough to be measured in seasons, yet long enough to accumulate errors of the kind that cannot be repaired quickly. The Orthodox narrative again emphasizes his incompetence, his religious policy, his financial exactions, his failure to secure loyalty. But those are not separate mistakes. They form a single pattern. Basiliscus repeatedly treated the empire as a possession to be used, not a balance to be maintained. In Constantinople, power was not primarily the ability to command. It was the ability to keep multiple constituencies satisfied enough that no coalition could form against the throne. It was a kind of equilibrium. Basiliscus disrupted that equilibrium on three fronts, and each disruption created enemies who did not need to love Zeno to prefer him. The first front was religion. The empire had been torn for decades by the Christological controversy, debates over how to speak of Christ's nature, debates that were not academic but political and social. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 had defined Christ as existing in two natures, divine and human, and this definition had become the official doctrine of the imperial church. Yet large parts of the eastern provinces, especially Egypt and Syria, were sympathetic to Miaphysite theology, emphasizing the unity of Christ's nature. Emperors did not merely choose doctrine, they chose which provinces to placate and which bishops to empower. Basiliscus issued an encyclical that favored the anti-Chalcedonian position, condemning Chalcedon and signaling sympathy for those who had resisted the council. To some in the provinces, this may have seemed a chance for reconciliation. To many in Constantinople, and especially to the patriarch Acacius and the city's monastic circles, it was an assault on orthodoxy and an invitation to chaos. The capital had its own religious identity, and it did not tolerate emperors who appeared to bargain doctrine for support. The result was immediate turbulence. The patriarch resisted. The city's religious leaders mobilized public sentiment. Basiliscus, seeking support in one direction, discovered he had opened a wound in another. When he attempted to reverse course under pressure, issuing a counter-edict, he achieved the worst of both worlds. He looked unprincipled to those he had tried to court and weak to those he had offended. A ruler can survive being wrong. It is harder to survive being seen as both wrong and easily bullied. The second front was money, and money in the late empire was never merely economic. It was a measure of legitimacy. Basiliscus inherited a strained treasury. The Eastern Empire was wealthier than the West, but its expenses were enormous. The army, the court, the grain supply, the subsidies to keep frontier enemies manageable. Basiliscus also inherited the long shadow of his earlier failure against the Vandals. That disastrous expedition in 468 had cost a fortune, one of the greatest catastrophes of the century. And although it occurred under Leo Vivae, Basiliscus's name was tied to it like a curse. In a court that remembered, the usurper's past was never safely passed. To secure loyalty and fund his regime, Basiliscus resorted to exactions and policies that quickly became unpopular. The details vary in hostile sources, and the degree of exaggeration is debated, but the pattern is consistent. Confiscations, heavy burdens, favors sold and bought, appointments that appeared less like governance and more like repayment, even when the state needed revenue, the manner in which it was taken mattered. It was one thing for the empire to tax. It was another for a new regime to look like it was looting. The third front was the army and the logic of patronage. Basiliscus elevated relatives and favorites, most notoriously his nephew Armatus, granting him high command and honors. Armatus appears in some sources as vain and easily swayed, but more important is what his rise signaled. Basiliscus was building a household state, concentrating military authority in family hands. Such moves could stabilize a dynasty once it was secure. For a usurper, it was gasoline poured on suspicion. Men who had helped Basiliscus take power could now imagine themselves replaced by Basiliscus's kin. In Constantinople, fear of being discarded often provoked preemptive betrayal. All of this created a fertile ground for dissent. Religious leaders could denounce the emperor not only as wrong, but as opportunistic. Senators could resent the financial pressures and the instability of property. Soldiers and generals could feel that the throne was being used to elevate a clique. Each group in isolation might grumble and endure. Together, they formed what Basiliscus could not see, a coalition in waiting. This is where Verina's network mattered. Dissatisfaction is common, coordination is rare. Basiliscus's blunders created the raw material of revolt, but it took skilled hands to shape that material into action. Verina's whispers could connect a offended bishop to a nervous senator, a disappointed commander to a resentful court official. Basiliscus's court became a place where everyone assumed everyone else was already turning, which is often how turning becomes inevitable. He had seized the throne by making Zeno appear impossible. Now he made himself appear unbearable. And somewhere beyond the walls of Constantinople, the man who had fled did what displaced emperors must do to survive. He listened, waited, and prepared to return not as a hated outsider, but as an alternative. Zeno's exile was not a romantic flight into the wilderness. It was a retreat to Isauria, to the rugged region that had given him soldiers and identity, an area the capital mocked, yet depended upon for manpower. From there, he could still send messages, distribute promises, and cultivate the bitterness of those whom Basiliscus had disappointed. Exile in the Eastern Empire did not always mean helplessness. It could mean freedom from the suffocating politics of the palace and access to loyal forces beyond the capital's immediate reach. The orthodox view sees Zeno's return as the restoration of legitimate rule. Another view sees it as the triumph of a more competent faction. Both contain truth. But what made Zeno's return possible was not merely his will. It was the fact that Basiliscus had created an opening large enough for an exile to walk through. Zeno's great advantage was that he did not need to be loved. He needed only to be preferable. The city that had despised him could tolerate him if the alternative looked worse. The generals who had betrayed him could return to him if he offered forgiveness and reward. The church that had resisted him could negotiate with him if he appeared more stable than the usurper. In a polity built on pragmatic compromise, restoration did not require moral purity. It required timing. The timing was prepared by the very men Basiliscus had used to expel Zeno. Among them were Isaurian commanders such as Ilus and his brother Trocundus, figures whose loyalty was transactional and whose calculations were cold. In some accounts, Ilus initially supported Basiliscus and held leverage by capturing Zeno's brother Longinus, thereby preventing Zeno from fully reassembling his power. Yet Basiliscus's inability or unwillingness to satisfy Ilus's expectations, coupled with Basiliscus's favoritism toward Armatus, pushed Ilus toward a new bargain. The man who had helped drive Zeno out became a bridge for bringing him back. Verina's role at this stage is complex and filtered through hostile chroniclers. Some sources portray her as turning against Basiliscus once he refused to make her chosen candidate supreme. Others show her suffering under Basiliscus's suspicion, even being restrained or sidelined. What is consistent is that Basiliscus did not have the full, stable loyalty of the imperial women's circle, and that circle could influence access, messaging, and legitimacy. Ariadne, Zeno's wife, remained a crucial piece of dynastic symbolism. Her position could be invoked to frame Zeno not as an invader, but as the rightful continuation of Leo's line. Even when Ariadne's inner intentions remain opaque, her existence made Zeno's claim harder to dismiss. Thus, Zeno's return was not simply an army marching on a city. It was a political operation. Letters, promises, and emissaries moved ahead of troops. The goal was to ensure that as Zeno approached, Basiliscus's supports would turn to water. The empire's power centers, church, senate, military, did not need to be conquered. They needed to be persuaded to stand aside. As Zeno advanced toward Constantinople in 476, the empire's mood was already shifting. Basiliscus attempted to secure loyalty with proclamations, with appointments, with reversals of policy, but reversals, when made too late, do not look like prudence, they look like panic. The city watched for signs of destiny, because in Constantinople destiny often arrived wearing armor. The decisive collapse came not in a climactic battle, but in a sequence of defections. Armatus, Basiliscus's favored nephew, negotiated with Zeno. Ancient sources accuse him of betrayal purchased with promises, titles for himself, safety for his son. Whether every detail is accurate or embroidered with moral judgment, the core fact remains. Basiliscus's regime could not rely on the very men it had elevated. The army that should have defended the usurper began to reconsider, then to abandon him. Constantinople, that great city of walls and harbors, did not need to be stormed if its gates were opened by exhaustion and calculation. Zeno's return became less a conquest than a reoccupation. Basiliscus, who had taken power in a moment of coordinated rejection, now faced the reverse, coordinated indifference. The court that had acclaimed him discovered it could acclaim another with equal ceremony. The drama of Zeno's re-entry into the capital lay in its speed. Political regimes in Constantinople could feel eternal one week and vanish the next. Basiliscus had imagined his crowning of Marcus would create a dynasty. Instead, it became a symbol of his overreach. He had imagined his religious edicts would create support. Instead, they created enemies. He had imagined his financial measures would stabilize his rule. Instead, they made him look predatory. By the time Zeno approached, Basiliscus's power was already hollow, a shell maintained by ritual and denial, and when power becomes hollow, the final act is rarely heroic. It is desperate, procedural, almost bureaucratic, an emperor reduced to bargaining with time. Basiliscus's last days in power revealed the cruelty of imperial politics. The throne offers no consolation prize. Those who seize it and fail do not retire into obscurity, they fall into the machinery that they once tried to command. As Zeno's supporters closed in, Basiliscus attempted what many doomed emperors attempted: appeals, proclamations, last-minute reconciliations. He sought to align himself again with the Chalcedonian establishment, courting the patriarch and the city's religious opinion. Yet this attempt did not erase months of conflict. In the logic of Constantinople, a ruler who changes doctrine for convenience is worse than a ruler who holds a wrong doctrine with conviction. The church could forgive error. It did not easily forgive cynicism. He attempted to secure military loyalty, but loyalty that must be purchased at the last moment is not loyalty. It is a sign that loyalty has already evaporated. The generals and courtiers around him could see the direction of events. Each man began to ask not what was right, but what would keep him alive when the new or restored regime settled accounts. Basiliscus, abandoned by those who had lifted him up, sought sanctuary. In this he followed a pattern of late antique politics. The church, even when politically entangled, could still function as a place where imperial violence was moderated by ritual. Basiliscus and his family took refuge in a church. Sources commonly placed their surrender in the context of ecclesiastical sanctuary, hoping that the sacred space would force terms. Zeno offered terms, and Basiliscus accepted. The exact wording of promises is filtered through later retellings, but the essential cruelty remains. Mercy in imperial politics was often a delay, not a pardon. Basiliscus, his wife Zenonis, and his son Marcus were removed from the capital, sent away from the stage where legitimacy was performed. They were confined in Cappadocia, at a place remembered as a cistern or a remote fortress, cold, enclosed, and deliberately symbolic. If emperors were made by the city, then defeated emperors were unmade by isolation. Their deaths were reported as death by starvation, sealed away from rescue. It is possible that later authors emphasize the harshness to heighten the moral lesson. Yet even if details blur, the outcome is clear. Basiliscus's line was extinguished. His brief experiment in dynastic replacement ended not with abdication, but with annihilation. The throne did not simply reject him, it erased him. Zeno returned, restored not because he had become beloved, but because the apparatus of empire decided it could function under him more reliably than under his rival. His restoration did not end intrigue. Far from it. The Eastern Roman Empire remained a realm where generals could revolt, where religious controversies could destabilize provinces, where imperial women and court factions could still determine succession. Verina herself would not disappear quietly into history's margins. Her later conflict with Zeno's regime, including her entanglement with rebellions that followed, suggests that the forces she represented were enduring. Basiliscus's fall did not eliminate the court's capacity to manufacture crises. It merely demonstrated its efficiency. The broader implications of Basiliscus's downfall are therefore not confined to a 9-month reign. His story exposes how the Eastern Roman Empire preserved itself not by preventing political violence, but by channeling it. The throne could be seized, but the empire demanded that the usurper quickly prove he could maintain balance among institutions that each possessed their own legitimacy. Basiliscus failed that test with unusual speed, and yet the story can be read in more than one register. Basiliscus can be framed as a cautionary figure, the incompetent usurper undone by arrogance. He can also be framed as a symptom, a man who rose because the capital could not tolerate Zeno, and who fell because the capital could not tolerate instability even more. In that reading, Basiliscus is less villain than instrument, briefly useful to those who wanted to punish Zeno, briefly tolerable to those who feared Isaurian dominance, and quickly disposable when his rule threatened the delicate arrangement that kept Constantinople governable. The overlooked factor, the one that reshapes the usual interpretation, is not merely Basiliscus's incompetence or Zeno's resilience. It is the court's hidden architecture of influence, especially the role of imperial women and their networks, which did not command armies but could redirect them by shaping legitimacy and access. Verina's shadow campaign represents a kind of power that ancient historians sometimes reduce to gossip because it did not resemble the power of legions. Yet, in a palace state, gossip could be strategy, a whisper could become policy, a marriage could become an army. Basiliscus lost because he treated the empire as something he could hold, when in truth it was something that held him. Zeno returned because he accepted the empire's terms, the need to bargain with institutions to survive, hated, to endure the city's contempt while keeping its mechanisms running. Neither man fully mastered the forces at play, but one understood them well enough to outlast the other. In the end, Basiliscus's reign is remembered not for reforms or victories, but for the speed at which power turned against him. That speed is the point. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in the 5th century as the West did, but it lived with constant internal peril, not always from invaders at the gates, but from sudden collapses of legitimacy within the walls. Basiliscus's tragedy was to learn too late that an emperor could be destroyed without a battlefield, undone by doctrine, patronage, and the quiet mathematics of betrayal. And Zeno's restoration, far from being a simple return to order, was a reminder of something more unsettling. In Constantinople, stability was not the absence of conspiracy. Stability was the temporary victory of one conspiracy over another until the next shadow moved across the palace mosaics and the crown began once again to feel unbearably light.